Hello dear listeners, this is I, the Angry History Chef, very tired from a long training weekend, and I have hopefully some exciting news or planned future news to tell you about my life, and this week's talk will mostly be aimed at medieval buildings and the structures and how it all goes together. So to start off with, the exciting news is I'm hoping to look at going into visiting schools and educating school kids as a historical reenactor. That's quite exciting. I've got to see what that entails to some degree, but I was chatting with people at the training weekend about it, and given what time periods they're looking for and everything else and what time periods they cover as a school visiting show, it seems to be right up my alley, and I'm all up for that. Also, I've now set up a Patreon page where there are only two tiers. There's a £1 tip jar and a £5 book fund jar, and that's pretty much all my Patreon is. I'm not looking to make a living off of it. I'm more just looking to help expand my knowledge base or keep myself in tea and books, basically, so I can keep producing these podcasts for you in my spare time. Or even not in my spare time, but in just my downtime between bits and pieces I've got working on, or should I say that I am working on. But this week is historical buildings and rural settlement in medieval England, early medieval England, late medieval England. I'm just going to go with medieval England, really. And what people really lived in, what we're looking at, distribution of settlements as a whole, how that developed from the 5th century through to really the 14th century, and what you should expect to see. Now, I've got a big old mug of tea, I've got my recording gear all set up, so let's get started. 5th century England, we have late Roman, early Saxon migration crossover period. Settlements are mostly based around the original Roman villas, a few other bits and pieces like that, large Roman settlements or parts or large Roman complexes where villages are built around the outside using the older styles. So you've got to consider Romans building concrete and brick, and the Saxons that move into England, and to some degree the common working person, builds in wood, wattle and daub. Now you may ask, how can we talk about early medieval structures when we don't have any standing? Because you've got to think wood rots, wattle and daub rots, because it's just cow muck, straw and mud and clay, should I say, mixed together, and which is your daub, and your wattle part is literally just willow with ease or hazel with ease, or very flexible thin branches woven in effect. I say thin, we're talking maybe an inch thick tops, spread, well, woven of course between posts and everything else, and there are plenty of videos out there on the mighty land of YouTube that explain how to do wattle and daub, so I'm not going to go into depth about that because there's not much point. What I'm here is more to talk about the development of settlements in England from about the 5th century onwards. And what you have, of course, as I've said many times, is a rural agricultural economy. You have a rural economy, so settlement is an interesting development. Everyone is just generally trying to make enough food and what they need to survive. It's not really until the mid-9th century onwards where we start seeing, due to the unification of England under Alfred, well, I say the mid-9th, the late, with Alfred taking the throne towards the mid-late 9th century, and the wars with the Anglo-Scandinavian forces in the north, plus the pure Scandinavian forces, you then start getting a unification of England. That develop and changes how England can be viewed per settlement, per rural population, per urban population. So, to some degree, the Great Heathen Army causes the development of the burh and the burgle-hidage system. Okay? Now, what you've got to understand is burhs were designed as places of retreat, but when, and to give a defence in depth, but when that threat has lessened to some degree, and England is a much more unified area in terms of you've got the actual clear divide between the Danelaw territories and the Saxon territories, you end up finding the burhs starting to develop more into centres of commerce, centres of trade, and centres of finance. What we have is a territory where mints can be set up because they're under heavy fortification, so there's less chance of coinage being, shall we say, dodgy. So you don't get things like clipping or false minting or anything that can devalue the penny. And you've got to remember that the lowest common Saxon coinage is the penny, and then of course it can be split into half, which is a half penny, or it can be split into 4 pieces, which is a 4 thing, or in later development of the English language as it goes along, of course, the farthing. So you end up with the penny, the halfpenny, and the farthing, which all stem from the penny, the halfpenny, and the 4 thing. Now, Saxon coinage, of course, just to quickly touch on that, is not to be confused with modern coinage. The Saxon coinage system is very much a single Saxon penny being made of solid silver, hence why also all British money is sterling, because it's all done generally in silver originally. But your original Saxon penny, depending on when you're looking at it, has a value from anywhere between £30 in modern terms to £300. It really can depend on the time frame you're looking at the value of a penny and how much it's worth. Sometimes some of those later, it can fluctuate, if you get what I mean, because of the value of one thing and another and the value of the penny. But on average, we tend to say in our period that we reenact a penny is worth about 30 quid. Okay, so you got 10 pennies. In modern terms, you've got about £300 in your back pocket. You've got 100 pennies, there's £3,000. Or more accurately, of course, being in mind that pennies become shillings and shillings become the pound, there is 20 pennies to a shilling, 12 shillings to a pound, which means there are 240 pennies to the pound. Okay, now that's old school currency. There are further things it would develop further, and then we eventually decimalise into pounds and pence. However, back then it was pounds, shilling, pence, with the halfpenny and the 4 thing. Now the 4 thing and the halfpenny don't really occur that much in the writings. You're mostly dealing in shillings, pounds, and pence. So you've got to bear in mind that if 1 penny is worth 30 quid, okay, and there's 240 pennies in a pound, you're looking at something like, and if my maths is right, I'm just going to use a calculator here because my brain is very, very, very fugued from the training weekend, but we could be looking at a quick bit of maths here. For those of you who don't have a melted brain, you'd be looking at £7,200 in modern value to an English pound back then. Okay, and if a suit of mail is going to cost you a couple of pounds, you can see why it starts getting more and more expensive. And you can see why war is not cheap when you are buying properties. And this is also the reason why I said it can fluctuate, because it can cost £10 for a good sword at the time in Anglo-Saxon terms. Well, £10 for a good sword, okay, is 72 grand. You see why war is for the rich man. And I think sometimes people don't understand that, and that's fine. But then when you look at it in a rural settlement situation, when you've not got urbanisation and you've got these earlier warband type armies where there isn't a structured obligatory type of warfare, there is, but it's much smaller and it's much more elitist. Okay, so the armies of, say, the 7th and 8th century might only have numbered 2,000 men tops, and that's including their baggage train and whatever else might be involved. By the time you get to the end of Alfred's reign and the reigns of Edward the Elder and Ethelflaed, these armies of course are going to be a couple of thousand apiece, and I'm saying 4,000 or 5,000, but there's structure in place to support that actually. From a logistical view, given the way the whole country has now been shifted with burgle-hidage and the way it uses to raise taxes and the urbanisation that occurs because of burgle-hidage, it allows for larger armies. Now, building in this period, in terms of your day-to-day buildings, are wooden posted, as I said previously, thatched, wattle and daubed huts. That is not to say, though, that they are rudimentary and crude. Again, these are people that know how to work in wood, they understand the principles of wattle and daub, they understand everything else. If you go to West Stow, or you happen to get chance to visit, the Witchwood, Oxfordshire, there is Regia's Hall there, okay, and you go and have a look at West Stow and at the Regia village, and I think it's Moorforge also up in Yorkshire, again a reconstruction of early medieval buildings. You come to realise that actually these are very sophisticated buildings using very simplistic materials at times, in terms of how big they made them, how well decorated they are, and how well illuminated they are in some respects. However, we also have to look at the added inclusion of workshops, like Grubenhausen, so the grub hut, to kind of translate, as an ancillary part of whether it's a store shed with a floating floor over a basement, so to speak, so you have a doorway which has steps going down under the basement, but then an access to other things, and whether they were used for purely living or ancillary jobs or storehouses, we to some degree don't know. We have well-educated guesses, and we kind of do this whole thing. But when we look at the actual construction, as I was saying, some of these properties are very well developed. I'm not saying they're like running water and modern, but for the period with the materials they have and everything else, there are some very sophisticated buildings that have been excavated over the years in England. And the big problem we've had is for a long time they weren't excavated, and it didn't hold any sway for archaeologists to look for settlements. John Blair talks about this in his wonderful book, The Building of Anglo-Saxon England. It's also made mention in Rural Settlements and Society in Anglo-Saxon England by Helena Hamrow, however you pronounce it, which both, shockingly enough, were, I believe, published. One is by Princeton Press, which is always nice, and the other is the Oxford University Press, of course. The Medieval History and Archaeology is actually the Oxford University's Press's range of books. I mean, I've got my other favourite one here, which refers to trees and timber in the Anglo-Saxon world. And this has a lot to do with churches and what wood's used in churches, ploughing, building boats, building houses, and all the different woods used to some degree, and the significance of those woods. The Rural Settlement book, much more useful if you want to look at society and then work out how armies would have been formed, if you get what I mean. And this is the problem. When you look at a subject like military structures, social structures and everything else, you can't look at it in a narrow field. This is why I often refer to myself as a jack of all trades, because my history collection, while extensive to some degree with military books, actually has a lot of books concerning artwork in the Anglo-Saxon world, religion in the Anglo-Saxon world, and the Viking world. And I always say Anglo-Saxon world, and I do apologise, but it's because I'm Anglo-centric in the fact I'm based in England. So all of my reading bases it on England and the developments of England as a nation. And I have to look outside of that, but what I'm looking for is the outside influence in the social structure and the societal structure of England, not the outside culture in the sense of its own unique thing. So a lot of my stuff I try to base off England rather than with the odd nod to other areas. For example, I like to refer to the Big Blue Book of Hedeby, which I also refer to as the Blue Bible Book of Hedeby, which is all in German, unfortunately. So sometimes it is very difficult to actually translate accurately at times what I'm reading in that one, but it is that full of pictures that sometimes it's a useful imagery context, and having a passing knowledge of being able to read German sometimes means I can pick out enough words that I can roughly get what they're trying to say. I may not always accurately get it, and I sometimes go back and have to use things like Google Translate in a German dictionary. So the Big Blue Book of Hedeby is useful because it means I have a continental context to some degree of a development of settlement also in a similar way to the Burrs are developed in England. And John Blair's book, Building Anglo-Saxon England, is a hefty old tome, folks. I mean, you could literally beat a man to death with it. It's not some lightweight little... Like, the Oxford books are all quite small paperbacks. They do a hardback version, but the paperbacks are much easier and kinder on the bookshelf. But unfortunately, John Blair's does not come in bloody softback version as far as I'm aware. I unfortunately had to get it as a hardback version. But I did manage to pick it up quite cheaply, because its original price was, I think, quite steep. And I managed to grab a copy for 30 quid because they needed to get rid of it off the shelf because they didn't really want to take anything back, and it was only the last one. So I got it for a steal for £30, but it's actually worth it about 60 to 70 or something daft. And I'm very good at doing that. I do tend to find a lot of books on good offer. But yeah, John Blair, very extensive book, very hard reading sometimes. I mean, I've read it 2 or 3 times, and even I've not always taken everything in. And I've kind of, when I've read it, I've not really read it cover to cover. I've read it and tried to find the stuff I was looking for. But if we go back to looking at settlements and building development, Booklands is where it all starts in terms of us looking at hereditary land and a unification of land holding and a development of farming where people aren't just farming to sustain themselves. They are then farming with an excess of produce. And it's why I always constantly refer to England as a rural agricultural economy, because it is. But what you see from the 10th century onwards is, due to bookland rights and hereditary passing on, is a continual process of developed animal husbandry and crop husbandry that allows for greater yields or better control over what you're growing, and you start getting greater returns. So people aren't actually farming, or they're making such an excess that they can then start making commodities. And this is why you see this, and this all stems to some degree of a unifying of Wessex under the Burr system, giving you centres of urban safety, which allows settlements to urban settlements and industries to take off, and then the rural development, because less land is being broken up, because settlements are also starting to get slightly bigger. So you have less settlements in some respects by the 10th century across England, but they're larger than, say, what they were in the 7th century. And I don't just mean in Wessex and Mercia, I'm talking the whole of England here. If you look to the 10th century, what you find, there are a lot of villages pop up and place names said, and those villages kind of start amalgamating into controlling areas. And I'm not saying they completely urbanise and become large sprawling settlements. No, a lot of them stay very small and focal, but the distance between each one is smaller. So a good example is North Nottinghamshire, where you get a good mix of all the different names here, where you've got Anglo-Saxon place names mixed with Viking place names mixed with like Norman place names, okay. Where you get Tunton, By, or B, should I say, so like Wetherby, Selby, all the others. And then you get like Thurgerton, Burton, well it's Burton Joyce, but the Joyce part is later, and Loudon, for example, again, Loudon exists, it's again, this is North Nottinghamshire, North-East Nottinghamshire, heading up the 614, 612, places I grew up. A lot of those places are, and above them, into North Nottinghamshire, all the way up to Worksop and everything else, you get a mix of Anglo-Saxon and Viking names. And the distance between them historically is minute, but they have communal churches that are their focal points. And the communal church is probably no more than an hour's walk from any one settlement. But those settlements might be farming 100 acres around them each. So you might have, if we look at medieval Loudon, medieval Burton, medieval Gonalston, and then Thurgerton, okay, it's the 4 settlements based around the Trent-ish region, and the church that kind of ties them together, which is just along from them, on the Trent, so to speak, and they're all about 4 or 5 miles from that one church. That territory, if you look at the medieval development of those villages, they are technically towns now to some degree. I mean, Burton Joyce has got almost 4,000 people living in it. Loudon, about 2,000 people living in it. Gonalston, about 1,000, and then Thurgton's about 1,500. Last census I looked at concerning those places. Now, in the medieval period, those 4 villages would all have been wattle and daub, thatched huts, but they were quite prosperous. And Loudon has a manor as well in the post-conquest period, and that manor kind of becomes the focal point for all tax collection and everything. But that's a post-conquest development with the manorial system. You see it to some degree in the Anglo-Saxon period, but it's the hundreds gathering, where it's every 100, if I remember correctly, it's every 100 hides. But what you have is, roughly speaking, is those 4 villages cover, roughly speaking, the medieval, those 4 villages cover something like 400, 500 acres of land, which, if you don't realise, is considerably large an area. Well, it's not considerably large, but it's a large enough area that you have to wonder how big were these village populations in our period. Now, I know from the Domesday Book to some degree, and from having grown up, lived around North Nottinghamshire, and I mean north of Nottingham, not right into North Nottinghamshire, right up the top in 614, almost getting into South Yorkshire. It's like, I know that area, but I'm talking northeast Nottinghamshire, in terms of just outside the city and the villages, so Lamley and Burton Joyce, and their medieval developments, particularly if you look to the Domesday Book at times, and they are mentioned, but you have to go hunting for them. Their settlements are, there is a watermill. Oh, Bramcutters. There's lots of little villages around there, and they're all medieval, and they're all kind of interconnected. But there's about 3 watermills within that 400 to 600 acre area because of the Trent. And it's like one at Gonalston, one at, I think, Bulkett, and one at, of course, by the end of the 11th century. But you're probably looking at about 100 people per village, okay? And you might think, oh, that's not a lot. Well, you might think, oh, that could be quite a lot, but you also might be thinking, oh, that's not a lot. And to some degree, 400 people over 4 villages isn't a small... It's not a huge amount, but it's not a small amount. But bearing in mind that that's 600 acres in early medieval England, might have almost 400 people scattered across it. And I'm including slaves to some degree as well, and indentured workers, plus any tenant farmers. But the landholding population of that, say, 400 people in that area who actually have the rights to that land might only be 6 or 7 people. That's it. And those 6 or 7 people might have a retinue still as well. This is where it all ties in, you see. But yeah, if you're looking in comparison though, so that's a 600 acre area of land with wattle and daub construction, with thatch roofs. Those buildings in that area are not pokey little huts in some respects. They're actually quite well designed and well built properties. And in some respects they actually would put modern buildings to shame in terms of their size. So some of the more low class ones will be a single building. But the length of them, from the archaeology we have, and when you look around England and you look at like some of the sizes of huts, or not huts, but some of the sizes of the properties found, they're surprisingly large. And like, some of the huts you find are 5 metres in width and almost 10 metres long. Okay, and they're built in wood and thatch and wattle and daub, but they've also got multiple rooms. And this is what we're talking like at the top end, so I would call this a Thainic house at 10 metres long, 5 metres wide. I'm not calling it the normal, but even the normal property, in terms of what you're doing with respect to a normal, relatively well-off, not required to fight by law, but a well-off farming family, you could be looking at a house that's 4 metres by 6 metres. And I'll grant you, you might be like, oh, but that whole family's got to fit in that one thing. They have, but you'd be surprised how comfortable you are in an agricultural economy where you might think, oh, I've got all this space, I've got it, but you've got to think, leisure time in terms of hobbies are a modern concept where there is a working day and you don't physically work, you're working at a desk all day or whatever else, and it's like, in an early medieval context, and I think this is what freaks my wife out, the Spooky Goth Wife, I think this is what freaks her out a bit, is that I would happily go back to just living. I want a lifestyle somewhere in between, where I've got a property with enough land to grow enough food on to feed me for a whole year, and it takes up my entire day. And I get up with the sun, I go to bed with the sun. And I think this is also because of the good life, and I've always wanted to lead it. But even Tom and Barbara, in some respects, have hobbies, because the difference again in this period is that you don't have a supermarket or a shop to go to buy your clothes. So you've got to spin and weave all your own stuff. So this is the whole thing. When we say an urban or rural agricultural economy based country, everything's got to be made by hand. And this is why I always point out that if you've got time to play games and do other things at times, you're wealthy because you've got spare time. Because in the evening, if you've got a fire, maybe tallow candles scattered around your 4 metre by 6 metre, and also these 4 metre by 6 metre like living conditions for a relatively well-off, free farming family, you will have a wife, a mother. You might have, so you'll have the wife, mother. If we based off, say, a nuclear family of 4, dad, mum, 2 kids, okay, and the kids are, the mum might be pregnant still, and those 2 kids might actually have been the only 2 that have survived so far. So the nuclear family idea falls down a bit because of infant mortality rates and everything else. But if we say, and also you've got to consider extended family that might be living with them as well. So you might actually also have in this house, you might also have the grandparents or of one of the family, if they're surviving. You've then also got to consider that there might be grub huts, as in like a Grubenhauser, alongside the main house. Then the slaves might just be in a grub house with their fire pit in the sunken floor because it's plenty shelter for a slave. When we talk about slaves in this period, we're not talking about slavery in the same context as slavery was in, say, 19th century America, where slaves were seen as disposable property, and they weren't seen, like, slaves in America are weird because they're not seen as valuable in some respects, because there's always more where that can come from. And the other thing in America is there was no way out of slavery. Once you were a slave in America, the only way you could not be a slave was to escape, at which point you could then be hunted and killed. In Anglo-Saxon Britain, and, well, in early medieval Europe, you could stop being a slave. You could get yourself out of slavery. People need to understand that the early medieval world had slavery in it, but that slavery to some degree was different to the slavery of the 19th century. Also, some of those slaves were actually indentured workers paying off debt by giving up their freedoms and working for free to pay off their debt, and when their debt was paid off, they were then free again. And that's, to some degree, early medieval society in a very microcosmic level, rural environment. And to go back to the houses and talking about their sizing and everything else, if you consider you've got to weave and spin all your own clothes, okay, spin all the threads yourself and then weave it and everything else, that takes up your whole day. And if you can't afford multiple slaves who can't do X, Y, and Z, who like literally are just, yeah, it's a really weird thing to explain to people, but it's like, if you can afford to buy cloth in certain weaves, colours, it's because you've either got enough slaves or enough lesser tenanted farmers or the wives of tenanted farmers who you maintain, and it's a very complex web. And you've got to think, so in an urban environment, houses are going to be packed in more, but everyone seems to have a small back garden. But if every house is generally say 3 metres wide by 4 metres long, and you think that's not a very big property, it's like there are flats in this country that are sold like that for one person, but that's because people's whole lives revolve around their property now. People's lives revolve around their houses. Back then, your life wasn't about your property, so to speak. Your life was about the job you did and what you needed to do that job. Your house was just your shelter, because in some respects, people didn't have hobbies. They weren't sat there playing on their Xbox. They weren't sat there reading books. They weren't sat there painting wargaming miniatures, for example. They were sat there at the end of the day, eating a meal, telling stories to each other, and relaxing from a hard day's work of labour. Whether it's reaping, whether it was sowing, ploughing, sowing, reaping, so to speak, and going through the cycle of harvest, if you like the whole agricultural system. So preparing the fields, sowing the fields, letting the fields grow and monitoring the fields while raising cattle, and that's in the rural environment. In the urban environment, you've got bowl turners, and you've got like carpenters and metal workers and everything else, and this is where you end up getting town markets and market towns popping up, because they become, due to the burgage system in some respects, and unifying England and fortifying England, we get a development of market towns, which were villages more centrally located around. Some people might argue that market towns really stem from a later post-conquest period, but I would argue myself, and from my own readings, that actually you probably started to get market towns popping up in the 10th century, but they just didn't develop in the same way that we see market towns in the 12th and 13th and 14th century, because while we get more industrialisation because of centres of urban development, like the different burghs that pop up, like Winchester, like Gloucester, like Chester, and everything else, Nottingham, for example, doesn't develop into an urban centre of commerce until the 12th century. It is literally just a fortified position guarding the Trent, and that's all it ever really is during the whole Saxon period. It's got a church, it's an urban environment, but the vast majority of it is probably people working farmland around it, and it just happened to be it's more likely to have been a port or a stopping off point with its church as a fortified position in like within the Shire, guarding the London to York Road north in some respects, and the crossing of the Trent and where that crossing point was. And it's like you don't actually see Nottingham develop into Nottingham it never even really is a market town. We are weirdly enough a royal estate actually throughout the whole 11th century period onwards. Like the conquest of Connaught makes Nottingham a royal estate. Connaught has allegedly there is a royal estate within Nottingham. Like Nottingham's there and there's a royal estate next to it, and Nottingham's like seen as, I think, like the local community of skilled workers that keep the estate running as like servants and everything else. And it's very weird with Nottingham because we are one of the weirdest cities now. And anyone who argues that Nottingham isn't a city because it doesn't have a cathedral, we do have a cathedral. It was built in 1886. It is Catholic. It's on Derby Road, and it is the Cathedral of St Bartholomew and St Mary, and that's what got Nottingham its city status in 1886. So we do have a cathedral, thank you, but it was built in the Victorian reign and right towards like the late Victoria, the 1886 period of Victoria. We see the development of Nottingham. It's fortified, but it's not a burh in the sense of Burgle Hydage. It becomes eventually a centre of commerce, of trade, and like coin minting, or a crossroad focal point, like a lot of the original burhs become down in Wessex. and in southern Mercia around Gloucester and around Winchester and like Exeter and any of the other burghs you wish to look up, they eventually all do tend to aim and become centres of commerce. Nottingham doesn't. One of the few that doesn't, just for some reason, until the post-conquest period. Then it does become a very large commercial thing, but that's more because I think because of the connection to the crown and being a royal estate in that respect. But Nottingham as a shire has a roaring agricultural economy, and the building development around Nottingham and the amount of small villages and settlements you see around Nottingham indicate this purely because they are there, and Nottingham is quite densely populated in the early medieval period with settlements. And I don't mean it's got high population density per square thing, but what I'm saying is when you look at how many villages there are in Nottingham that still exist today, as existed in like the medieval period in the Domesday Book, that number really hasn't changed much. We've got very fertile ground. We have excellent ground for growing crops. We have excellent ground for growing cattle on, be it sheep, cows. You know what I mean? Animal husbandry is part and parcel of Nottinghamshire's history. We have excellent woodland capabilities. It's like Nottingham is one of the interesting shires to look at because it doesn't contain any of the major royal early medieval Anglo-Saxon monarchy early medieval English monarchies major factors. What it does contain though is a lot of rural agricultural based economies that boom. One of the church tithes, courtesy of a friend, working with Southern Minster and the Nottingham universities, got me access to some of the original records, so to speak, from Southern Minster's history that were still there, that hadn't been destroyed by Henry VIII. And one of the big ones was, I think it's late 10th century. Didn't get a year, but it's late 10th century. He only got it me as like secondary source material. But bearing in mind cattle in this period is smaller, but Nottinghamshire produced as a tithe for the church something like 55, and it was an anomalous year as well. And it is recorded as being like an anomalous amount. Like the normal amount is recorded at something like 20,000 head of cattle off the whole shire is the tithe to the crown and the church as a combined thing, of which apparently at least half is vellum. Okay. Now you've got to understand vellum is for writing on, making manuscript, books, whatever else. So you're looking at like 10,000 sheets of vellum. It's very labour intensive, and 10,000 sheets of vellum is a lot of vellum, but it's also not a lot of vellum. But even so, 20,000, that means the other 10,000 hides was leather for shoes, belts, stuff requiring leather. That's a lot of leather. Well, that's a lot of hides, but that was just one shire, and that was like their normal tithe was like something daft like 15 to 20,000 hides a year. A year, because it's like cattle development was just meat on, and it's like when you think of how much meat that is as well, even with smaller cattle. And when I mean smaller cattle, I do mean considerably smaller cattle, almost a foot shorter in both directions than a modern like Jersey is. They were much, much smaller. And those hides are not much, like, they're really not that big. But there was an anomalous year, and it's in the late 10th century, and I want to say it was the 990 or it was 980. It's very much late 10th century. But Nottinghamshire produced 50,000 head of cattle for hides. That is an enormous amount of leather and vellum. Bearing in mind it's something like 27,000 hides for vellum is produced. 27,000 hides off a single shire was enormous amounts. But I don't know what the specifications, what classed as a hide, if you see what I mean. So it could be that actually all the numbers are much smaller, but because of the way the early medieval English, aka the Anglo-Saxons and the early Anglo-Scandinavian stuff, worked out what a hide equated to in terms of leather production, it could actually have been just a single beast. and they actually cut it into, for example, and you know what I mean, it's not a whole, there isn't a defined thing of what an actual hide is, so we don't have that to work from, but all it says is within that was a 55,000 hides produced for the tithe to then be sold at like market. So that tithe is the combined tax for people paid to the church, but the church then, to actually make money off that or to generate revenue off that, of course, then sells it back to the community, to tradesmen, to everything else. And it's how you get an economy, folks. You produce one thing, you sell it to someone else, that someone sells it then to the tradesman. And this is the whole thing of booklands, going right back circular to booklands. Booklands gives you unification of land and gives you hereditary rights to land, which allows you better farming practices because the land isn't constantly changing hands. And with the unification of England to some degree and booklands becoming prominent in the 7th and 8th centuries, you start seeing this development of better agricultural things. And then by the 10th century, with the development of better social statuses, thainic ranks, and the early out days of not feudal manors, but of thainic manors, and the controlling of the 100 hides, and then in the late 10th, early 11th century with Sven and his application of social status and development of the society with ranks and everything else, and you throw in all the burgle hiding, you suddenly see why England becomes a very tasty target for Normandy, for example. We have a ridiculously well organised bureaucratic system of taxation and production of wealth and goods. And that's not something that happened overnight. It literally takes the better part of 300-400 years from the 7th century onwards, basically. You're talking 600s to 1000 AD, in effect. I prefer to think of it more as 650 to 1050, and that's a bit easier, because, like, anything after 1050 is like, I tend to refer to it as the pre-conquest period, because that's when you start after 1050, that's when you start getting the more Norman influences in England, and then you get the conquest in 1066, and how actually, again, the conquest changes the landscape, and stone buildings start appearing. But all the stone buildings aren't your day-to-day houses still. They are churches, becoming more predominantly built in stone. Now, stuff in the Saxon period was built in stone at times, but it's very rare, and it is mostly churches and the odd hall and watch-out towers and the foundations for fortifications. It's not whole fortifications. They're not building huge stone walls at times. What they do is they sometimes build stone revetment works that they put a palisade on top of, because it's more durable than an earth revetment with a palisade on top of. But stone does exist in the Saxon period as well. But what I'm saying is we see a change again in the rural and urban landscape, because of course that manorial system, as I was on about, comes in properly under feudalism, and the manors and the clerks and the whole taxation system is developed even further in the post-conquest period, particularly by Henry I and Henry II. Like Henry II, oh my god, that man was a powerhouse of urban and rural development in the whole country, to some degree, and reinforcing and structuring the whole system to support itself better. So yeah, it is one of those things where it's a continual development of building structures in England that we look at from the base level regions that don't really change at all, actually, up until maybe the 15th century, late 15th, well, I say late 15th century, no, that's a lie. Urban development of buildings changes. So what we end up with is a development of still wattle and daub to some degree, but they are multi-storey, and they're narrow at the base, and they start to overarch, and you get this, like, streets where, of course, you get the overhang buildings. And some of these buildings actually, what are known as timber frame buildings, of course, but they are, for all intent purposes, they're just a development of carpentry and building structure. But their development stems from, to some degree, the building of castles and the woodwork involved in building and supporting the massive amount of stone that is required. And the carpentry that goes into building a castle can be applied to building urban houses, but you don't have to worry about the stone. So you can build beautiful wooden frame, like, so the stone is self-supporting, but the scaffolding techniques to allow you to build properties that big and how they work to some degree is how you end up having multi-storey housing property, because you're not having to worry about the stone, but you can build completely foundations in stone foundations, I'll grant you, but you can build wooden structures in a way, so you could build like a small brick, not brick, but a small stone foundational structure, and then build wood on top of that and have like 2 or 3 stories in an urban environment. And then, but in a rural environment, what you get in the flip side of that is actually the development of the crook cottage. And there's still plenty of them floating around. Trust me, there's a couple in Nottinghamshire I know of. One's in Epperstone, I think, and the other one is up near Wisby and Weathersby up into up the 614. But there's a crook cottage somewhere around there, and you can see it, and it's still lived in. It's in the village, and it's a single property, and it's quite big. And I do mean big. But the crook cottage again is a further development of the old school Anglo-Saxon buildings, and even in the 12th century, 13th century, and 14th century, in urban environments, buildings develop. But in rural environments, they don't really change. Throughout this period, as buildings are developing, and we're looking at continuously just working wattle and daub 90% of the time, with about 10% being built in stone or working in stone, this whole thing means you're unifying the land. And I'm going to stop there actually, because I've realised I'm waffling a bit. Like and subscribe. Look to my Patreon page now, folks, and we will see you anon. Hopefully this month should be the Lord of the Rings fantasy talk. I'm off to see River Cruise today, and I'm looking forward to that because it is just a copy of the River Queen, the African Queen, with Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn in, but it's got Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Jack Whitehall, and I think no, it's not Emma Stone, I think it's Emily Blunt or whatever. But thanks for listening, and I will talk to you all again at some other point. Thanks and bye.